Hi, my name is Eric, and the story I'm about to tell you happened 3 years ago. To this day, I can't walk into a forest without feeling that cold, creeping dread crawling up my spine. It's a memory I've tried to forget, but no matter how hard I try, it keeps coming back, vivid as ever, especially late at night when everything is silent and I can hear my own heartbeat. It started on what was supposed to be a relaxing Saturday. City life had been suffocating me, so I decided to take a solo hike to clear my head. There was a forest about an hour outside town called Blackwood Forest, a place I'd heard of but had never visited. Something about its reputation intrigued me. It was vast, dense, and untouched by heavy foot traffic. I packed lightly, a bottle of water, a flashlight, a small knife, and my phone. With the sun shining bright and a crisp breeze in the air, it seemed like the perfect day for an adventure. The hike started beautifully. The trail was quiet, the air smelled of pine and earth, and sunlight poured through the canopy in golden streams. Every step I took seemed to pull me further away from my stress and closer to a sense of peace. But as the hours passed and the trail grew narrower, the trees started to close in around me, their branches forming a tangled ceiling that blocked most of the sunlight. The warmth of the day faded, replaced by an unsettling coolness, and the chirping of birds gave way to an eerie silence. At first, I thought the quiet was just my imagination. Forests can play tricks on your senses, right? But the deeper I went, the stronger the feeling became, this sensation that I wasn't alone. I glanced over my shoulder more than once, expecting to see anyone, but the trail behind me was always empty. Still, the hair on the back of my neck wouldn't settle down. I tried to laugh it off, blaming my overactive mind, but the unease clung to me like a shadow. Then came the smell. It hit me out of nowhere, sharp, acrid, unmistakable. It smelled like something burning, but not wood or leaves. It was something heavier, meatier, like charred flesh. My stomach twisted as I tried to place it, and I instinctively covered my nose with my sleeve. The scent wasn't faint, it was strong and growing stronger, pulling me toward its source against my better judgment. As I pushed further into the thick underbrush, I spotted smoke rising through the trees ahead. My curiosity got the better of me, and I crept closer, trying to be as quiet as possible. The scene that unfolded before me was like nothing I'd ever seen before. There was a small clearing, and in the center of it, a fire burned high, surrounded by figures clad in black robes. Their hoods were drawn low, concealing their faces, but the eerie chanting that spilled from their lips sent shivers racing down my spine. The centerpiece of the ritual was a grotesque statue, standing about 6 feet tall. It had the vague shape of a human, but its proportions were twisted and wrong, its head too large, its limbs grotesquely elongated, and its face distorted into something that barely resembled a human expression. Around the base of the statue were markings I didn't recognize, etched into the ground like some kind of ancient runes. I crouched behind a tree, holding my breath as I watched. My heart pounded so hard I was sure they could hear it. They continued their ritual, their movements synchronized as if rehearsed 1,000 times, but then something happened that made my blood run cold. One of the robed figures stopped and turned their head, looking straight in my direction. I ducked lower, pressing myself against the rough bark of the tree, praying they hadn't seen me, but the silence that followed was deafening. When I dared to peek again, they were all facing me. It was like they knew exactly where I was hiding, even though I was sure I hadn't made a sound. One of them shouted something in a language I didn't understand, and the group began moving toward me in unison. Panic exploded in my chest. I didn't think, I just ran. The forest seemed darker now, the trees more oppressive, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers to slow me down. I zigzagged between them, trying to shake off the figures chasing me, but their footsteps were relentless, closing in with every passing second. I glanced back only once, and the sight nearly paralyzed me. They weren't running, yet somehow they were gaining on me, their movements unnaturally fluid, like shadows sliding over the ground. My lungs burned, and my legs screamed for rest, but I couldn't stop, not when they were so close. I stumbled onto a narrow trail, one I hadn't noticed before, and followed it blindly, praying it would lead me somewhere safe. The sound of rushing water reached my ears, and I realized the trail was leading me toward a small river. If I could cross it, maybe I could lose them. I reached the riverbank, my shoes sinking into the mud as I splashed into the freezing water. The current was stronger than I anticipated, but I pushed forward, my eyes darting back toward the forest. The figures had stopped at the edge of the trees, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. They didn't follow me into the water, but one of them raised an arm and pointed at me, their hood slipping back just enough for me to catch a glimpse of their face, or what should have been a face. It wasn't human. The skin was pale and stretched taut, the eyes sunken and lifeless, and the mouth, God, the mouth, was too wide, filled with jagged teeth that looked like they belonged to some kind of predator. I stumbled backward, nearly losing my footing in the river, and when I looked again, they were gone. I made it to the other side and didn't stop running until I found myself back on the main road. A car approached in the distance, and I flagged it down, waving my arms frantically. The driver, an older man, slowed and rolled down his window, his face etched with concern. "Are you okay?" he asked, but all I could manage was a shaky, "Please, just drive." As we sped away, I looked back one last time. The forest stood silent and unmoving, but I could feel their eyes on me, even from a distance. I haven't set foot in a forest since that day, and I've never told anyone about what I saw, partly because I don't think anyone would believe me, and partly because I'm not sure I even believe it myself. But there's one thing I know for certain: whatever they were, they weren't human, and whatever they were doing in that forest wasn't meant to be seen. My name is Thomas, and I've always had a deep appreciation for nature, finding peace in the quiet solitude of the wilderness, where every breath of fresh air feels like a balm to the soul. But there's something about my last hike that left me scarred in a way I never thought possible. It was supposed to be a simple day trip, a chance to escape the chaos of city life and reconnect with the calm and predictable rhythm of the forest, but what I encountered was anything but calming, and it's an experience I still struggle to make sense of. That morning was perfect for a hike. The sun was shining brightly, the sky was a vibrant blue without a single cloud to mar its vastness, and the crispness of the early autumn air was invigorating. I chose Reed Ridge Forest, a sprawling woodland I had visited a couple of times before, though I had never ventured deep into its heart. With a small backpack containing water, snacks, a flashlight, and a roll of fluorescent tape for marking trees, I felt prepared and confident, unaware of the nightmare that awaited me. The trail started wide and inviting, cutting through tall trees that seemed to welcome me with their golden leaves swaying in the light breeze. As I walked, I placed a strip of fluorescent tape on every few trees to mark my path, ensuring I wouldn't lose my way on the return trip. It was a habit I picked up from my father during camping trips as a kid, and it always gave me a sense of security. As I ventured deeper, the forest began to change subtly. The trees grew denser, their branches intertwining above to create a canopy that filtered the sunlight into scattered, dim patches. The sounds of the forest, which had initially been a comforting background melody of birdsong and rustling leaves, grew quieter until only the occasional crack of a distant twig disturbed the heavy silence. After about an hour of hiking, I decided it was time to turn back. I had reached a clearing that seemed like a good endpoint, but as I prepared to retrace my steps, a faint noise caught my attention. It was distant, almost imperceptible at first, but distinct enough to make me freeze. It wasn't a natural forest sound, it was too deliberate, like someone, or something, moving cautiously among the trees. I turned toward the direction of the noise, scanning the woods, but there was nothing, just an endless expanse of trunks and shadows. Shaking off the unease creeping up my spine, I decided to ignore the sound and head back. Following the trail of fluorescent tape should have been straightforward, just follow the brightly colored markers back to the main path, but as I began walking, I noticed something strange. The markers didn't seem to be where I had placed them. Some were further apart than I remembered, and others appeared to be on trees that weren't even on the trail. At first, I thought I must have been mistaken. Perhaps I hadn't been as meticulous as I believed, but as I continued, it became undeniable. The markers had been moved. My heart began to race, a quiet panic bubbling in my chest as the realization sank in. Someone, or something, had deliberately tampered with them. I tried to remain calm, reasoning that if I just kept walking, I would eventually find my way back. But every step seemed to lead me deeper into unfamiliar territory. The trees looked different, the air colder, the silence heavier. And then I heard it again, a sound that stopped me dead in my tracks. It was laughter, faint but unmistakable, echoing through the woods in a way that made it impossible to pinpoint its source. I called out, my voice trembling as I asked if anyone was there, but the only response was the eerie stillness of the forest. I quickened my pace, hoping to stumble upon a familiar landmark, but instead, I found myself standing before something that made my blood run cold, a dilapidated cabin in a small clearing. Its wood withered and dark, with an air of abandonment that suggested it hadn't been touched in decades. What stopped my heart, though, wasn't the cabin itself, but what was parked beside it. My car. The same car I had left at the trailhead hours earlier, now sitting there like a surreal, misplaced puzzle piece. Its tires were slashed, the once bright paint smeared with dirt, and the driver's side door slightly ajar. My throat went dry as I tried to comprehend how it had gotten there. I approached cautiously, every instinct screaming at me to turn and run, but my curiosity compelling me forward. As I reached the car, I felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. I turned slowly, and that's when I saw him, or it. Standing at the edge of the clearing, partially obscured by shadows, was a figure. He was tall, dressed in tattered clothes, his stance unnaturally still, and his face. I'll never forget that face. Or rather, the lack of it. The space where his face should have been was blank, smooth like polished stone, yet it radiated a menacing energy that made my stomach churn. He didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel his gaze piercing through me, and that's when the panic set in. I bolted, running as fast as my legs could carry me, not caring which direction I went, only knowing I needed to get as far away as possible. The forest seemed to twist and shift as I ran, the trees forming barriers and tunnels that made no logical sense. My lungs burned, my legs ached, and my mind raced with fragmented thoughts of survival. The sound of footsteps behind me was relentless, deliberate, as if the figure was toying with me, letting me think I had a chance to escape. After what felt like an eternity, I broke through the dense underbrush and stumbled onto the shore of a lake. The water was eerily calm, reflecting the pale light of the overcast sky, and on the far side, I saw them, 3 fishermen in a small boat. I screamed for help, waving my arms frantically, and they turned toward me, their faces etched with confusion and concern. One of the fishermen steered the boat toward me, and as they approached, I collapsed to my knees, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. They helped me into the boat, their questions about what had happened barely registering in my mind as I glanced back toward the tree line. The figure stood there, motionless, watching me with an intensity that sent shivers down my spine, and as the boat drifted further from the shore, he slowly raised a hand, pointing directly at me before fading into the shadows of the forest. The fisherman took me back to safety, and I immediately contacted the authorities, but when they returned to the forest, there was no trace of the cabin, the figure, or even my car. The only thing they found were scattered pieces of fluorescent tape, stuck to random trees in no particular order, as if mocking my attempt to navigate the woods. To this day, I can't explain what happened, and I don't think I ever will, but I know one thing for sure, that forest wasn't normal, and whatever was in it wasn't human. My name is Marcus, and solitude has always been my sanctuary, a source of peace in a world that often feels too loud and chaotic. Ever since I moved into this small house by the lake, my nightly walks along its tranquil shores have been my favorite part of the day. The lake, surrounded by dense trees and bathed in moonlight, felt like a haven, a place where the world slowed down, and I could lose myself in the rhythmic sound of water lapping against the shore. That night started like any other. The sky was a deep, infinite black scattered with stars, the air cool and crisp, carrying the faint, earthy scent of the lake. As usual, I set out after dinner, flashlight in hand, the beam cutting through the dark like a fragile tether to the safety of my home. The familiar crunch of gravel underfoot and the distant croaks of frogs in the reeds created a soundtrack so soothing that it was easy to let my guard down. But that night wasn't like the others. It started with a sound, a low, dragging noise, barely audible over the natural symphony of the night. At first, I thought it was the wind, perhaps shifting a branch or rustling through the underbrush, but as I paused to listen, I realized it was deliberate, rhythmic, the sound of something heavy being pulled across the ground. I turned my flashlight toward the far side of the lake, squinting to see through the shadows, and that's when I saw him. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, was dragging a large black plastic bag across the rocky ground. Even from a distance, I could tell the bag was heavy, its contents shifting awkwardly with every tug. It didn't take much imagination to guess what might be inside. I froze, my breath caught in my throat, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure it would give me away. He didn't seem to notice me at first, too focused on his grim task, and I watched, paralyzed, as he heaved the bag to the edge of the lake. For a moment, he stood there, catching his breath, and then, with a sudden, violent motion, he pushed the bag into the water. The bag floated for only a moment before sinking slowly into the dark water, disappearing beneath the surface like a stone swallowed by the depths. I didn't move, didn't dare make a sound, but then it happened. My foot slipped on a loose branch, snapping it clean in two, the sharp crack cutting through the silence like a gunshot. He turned toward me, his movements slow and deliberate, his face illuminated briefly by the pale glow of the moon. It was a face I'll never forget, expressionless yet menacing, as if he was weighing whether to chase me or leave me to my fate. For a moment, I thought he might turn back, but then he began to move, his stride steady and purposeful, closing the distance between us. Panic gripped me, and I ducked behind the nearest tree, my hands trembling as I fumbled for my phone. My mind raced, trying to process what I'd just seen, but all I could think about was calling for help. My fingers felt clumsy, the numbers on the screen blurring as I dialed. 911, what's your emergency? The operator's voice crackled on the line. I whispered urgently, my voice barely audible over my pounding heart, there's a man, he's dragging something. I think it's a body. By the lake, near my house. Please send someone quickly. The operator assured me help was on the way, but the minutes felt like hours. I peered around the tree cautiously, hoping the man had given up, but he was still there, searching methodically, his flashlight sweeping across the shoreline. I crouched lower, holding my breath as his beam passed dangerously close to my hiding spot. Finally, the distant wail of sirens shattered the suffocating silence. Red and blue lights flickered through the trees, and I watched as the man froze, his head snapping toward the sound. For a moment, I thought he might run, but instead, he stood his ground, his shoulders squared as if resigned to his fate. When the police arrived, their shouts broke the stillness, ordering the man to drop his flashlight and raise his hands. He complied without resistance, his expression unreadable as they cuffed him and led him away. I emerged from my hiding spot cautiously, my legs shaking as I approached the officers. They asked me to recount what I had seen, and as I described the man and the bag, their faces grew grim. They sent a team to search the lake, and it wasn't long before they pulled the bag from the water. The smell hit first, acrid and unmistakable, and when they opened the bag, the contents confirmed my worst fears, a young woman, lifeless and pale, her body bearing marks of violence that told a horrifying story. The officers spoke in hushed tones, their radios buzzing with updates, but one detail cut through the noise like a knife. They had found footprints leading away from the scene, tracks that didn't match the man they'd arrested. There had been someone else there that night, someone who had slipped away before the police arrived. The realization sent a new wave of fear crashing over me. While one monster was in custody, another was still out there, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had become part of their story, an unwanted witness to their crime. In the days that followed, I tried to return to my normal routine, but the weight of that night lingered. The once comforting silence of the lake now felt oppressive, every shadow a potential threat, every sound a warning. I stopped walking by the water, stopped looking out the windows that faced the lake, but the feeling of being watched never went away. I reported every strange occurrence to the police, the unfamiliar car parked down the road, the footprints in the soft dirt near my porch, but there was only so much they could do. The fear consumed me, and eventually, I made the only choice that felt safe. I moved. Packing up my life and leaving the lake behind felt like abandoning a part of myself, but I couldn't stay. Even now, in my new home miles away, I can't shake the paranoia, the sense that the second figure might come looking for me. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I hear the sound of something heavy being dragged across the ground, and I wonder if leaving was enough to keep me safe. The memory of that night will haunt me forever, the man by the lake, the bag sinking into the water, and the knowledge that somewhere out there, his accomplice might still be watching.